Yeah, thanks, Viu and Pete, for having us, for organizing this. And I'm really glad to give this talk together with Asa and Carwin. So the reason we want to use this opportunity to talk about this is because in recent couple of years, a small group of Chinese cities are started being called as wanghong chengshi, or roughly translated as internet celebrity cities. So we're sort of interested in the phenomena and want to use this opportunity to think about what this phenomenon means, what it entails, what impacts there might be. But before Asa and, why is this not playing? Oh, sorry, that's working. Before Asa and Colin took over to talk more about what these internet celebrity cities actually are about, I'm going to use the first half to talk a bit about arts districts, which is my research from my PhD. And especially talk about the aesthetic aspects of arts districts. This is because we see there is a continuity between this consumption of arts districts as places and the sort of the rising phenomenon of internet celebrity cities, with a particular focus on the consumption of an aesthetic. So in this first half, I will talk what I identify as an aesthetic of arts districts, which enabled these places to be turned into both for consumption and to be consumed. And I will use two arts districts as examples. One is 798 arts districts in Beijing, and the other is 𝗲旄旻in Chongqing. As a very brief context or background to what these places are, so arts districts sort of emerged in Chinese cities around late 1980s, early 1990s, mostly as grassroots artist communities first, and especially in cities that has a strong fine arts institutes presence like Beijing and Shanghai. But also in Chongqing, with the existence of the Sichuan Fine Art Institutes in the 𝗲旄旻neighborhoods, that's where there also emerged a very strong sort of artist community presence. And then these grassroots artist villages or communities then went through processes of being ignored and then being sort of censored and controlled by governments, and then some sort of went through being demolished. And then when it comes to 2005, 2006, there's quite a few municipal governments started officially recognizing them and sort of designating them, especially as cultural and creative industry clusters. So 798 in Beijing was recognized or institutionalized in 2006, and 𝗲旄旻in Chongqing was around the same time being identified as an official arts districts. So these photos from those officially sanctioned art festivals are sort of examples or reflections of their official status of these arts districts. So during my research, one of the main complaints I heard from artists, galleries, and other relevant practitioners is that the arts districts are not for arts anymore, or not where arts happens anymore. Although many of them still have space in those places, or some of them still have, and we still see many art exhibitions and events happening there. However, we can definitely see there is a changing environment or atmosphere of arts districts at that time. And especially nowadays, the arts districts in China very much resemble a sort of a commercial district with cafes, bars, restaurants, shops, and so on. And dotted in those edges with maybe a few arts spaces managed to survive and lend the legitimacy to the arts district name. So I sort of documented how this change happened and what the dynamics underlying these changes were in two of my publications that I listed here. So if you are interested in some of the details, you could look into them there. So my argument is that the fact that arts districts went through these transformations partly because they became sort of local or national attractions of tourists, but also local visitors. So they became spaces to be consumed first, and then they became spaces for consumption more than art. And to some extent, in some places, this change was aided by policies. So for example, in Beijing, the urban policies and planning relevant documents clearly identifies arts districts as they should be developed as tourist attractions. But in general, I would argue that the fact that arts districts become such attractions is that they were enabled or facilitated through a constructed aesthetic of arts districts. So I want to sort of focus on how this aesthetic was constructed, what went through into it. And to identify that, I looked mostly into media narratives about these places, and especially about the two cases that I'm going to focus on here in the coverage about them. And then these narratives sort of work together with existing knowledge, perception, and public discourses about elements of arts districts to sort of produce an aesthetic of them. I will expand on these points now. So the aesthetic of arts districts that I identify, I see them there is being constituted of two linked aspects. One is what I call a mystery aesthetic, which I think results from the fact that arts districts tend to use post or still industrial spaces, and they function mainly, or their purpose mainly was for as spaces for arts communities and for Chinese contemporary art. So they are sort of situated existing knowledge and perceptions of all these elements, which constructed or make arts districts into places that provide entrance into one's mysterious and exclusive spaces and realms that are now accessible to the general public. So especially with the help of media narratives, these elements are particularly being highlighted when there's media coverage about them, especially in the early days when these arts districts first becoming officially recognized. So for example, in the two cases here, 798 and Huangjue-Ping, they were both based in spaces that used to be military factories or military warehouses. So in the media coverage about them, there is a particular highlight of this mysterious military industrial past. And the numerical sort of code names attached to these buildings or these places already evoke this image like 798 or 501, that the photo here is 501 in the Huangjue-Ping neighborhood in Chongqing. So they already sort of evoke this image of this mysterious past, and the media coverage sort of emphasize that. So for example, this quote from early coverage about 798 talked about how important that place was for China's first atomic bomb and first artificial satellite, and so on. And in addition to that, these spaces also associated with a sort of a lost urban past, namely danwei or work unit. So for those who are not necessarily very familiar with this concept, danwei could be industrial or non-industrial working living units. It was one of the principal territorial forms for organizing urban population during the sort of socialist central planning era. And although it's typically being translated into work unit, it functions more than just a workplace as a source of employment. It also is sort of a social institution that provides services and sort of to the employees but also their family members. And so it sort of forms integrated communities through which urban residents derive their sense of place and social belonging. For the younger generation, they may be aware that the existence of this sort of spatial organization, socio-spatial organization in the past, but may not necessarily have the experience of living in or even seeing one. So these arts districts to some extent helps preserve this urban past that no longer really exists in many Chinese cities, especially the large Chinese cities. And so in the 798 case, because the arts district sort of taken over an existing compound, so it sort of preserves it, even though maybe only fragments of it, only the facade of that. Versus in the case of Huangjueping in Chongqing, the neighborhood where the arts district is part of sort of still shows this kind of very close spatial meeting of life, work, and social activities and so on. So it's still these elements add on to the narratives about arts districts that make them sound or look like a time tunnel through which one could get a glance of the urban past that many know, but haven't really been able to get access to or see it in person. So for example, this tea house that I have a photo here in Huangjueping is an element, even though it's not really part of the arts district, but because it's in the neighborhood, it's constantly being brought up in the media coverage about the arts districts, and to talk about how if you go there, you would get a sense of this is where the time flowing backwards and so on. So in addition to this sort of mysterious past that one no longer, one sort of know but no longer able to see, and so these arts districts one could get experience of, there's also this mystery aesthetic also kind of includes some long existing images and imaginations about what contemporary artists and their communities and what contemporary art is like in China. So today's arts districts are associated with some of the really strong impressions or stereotypes about what contemporary artists are like, and they're sort of perceived as strange, unorthodox, anti-authoritarian, and mainly being portrayed, about how they dress in a very non-stream way. So for example, in this quote from a media coverage about Huangjueping in Chongqing, where the reporter talked to residents who were talking about in the 1980s, he was seeing artists on the street and then talking about how women shave their head and men grow their long hair and so on. And this sort of image still to some extent exists today. Despite the fact there is a small group of Chinese contemporary artists that have already acquired international fame and commercial success, but to a large extent, most contemporary artists in China still sort of exist or live at the margin of the Chinese society. So this sort of image still stay very strong in a lot of people's mind, and that's add on to this image or this idea about arts districts having sort of a mystery aesthetic. And this perception is also reinforced by the status of contemporary art in China, partly because since its inception in the 1980s, Chinese contemporary art went through a quite long period of being underground and didn't really acquire its legitimacy until the early 2000s. So this once illegitimate status is an element that's also being highlighted in media coverage. So for example, here is a quote from an artist being interviewed who talked about back then, artists who made contemporary works were like rats, they had to hide and flee constantly. And this history of contemporary art really reinforce the sort of public perception of what contemporary artists, arts communities are like, and contribute to constructing this mystery aesthetic of nowadays, although they are officially recognized and accepted contemporary artists and arts districts, they still sort of associated with this image. And the fact that contemporary art tends to adopt rather untraditional art language and media also reinforce this characterization of arts districts as being mysterious. So for example, this quote again about 7 and 8 talk about if you go into a factory building turned into galleries, you might see a sculpture that you, no matter how close you get to, you will not be able to understand what that is. So overall, all these elements that are associated or about arts districts have, there are already knowledge or perceptions and discourses about them. And the media narrative to some extent reinforces those perceptions and images, and together they constitute a mystery aesthetic that characterizes arts districts as places that provide access to these once mysterious or exclusive spaces, which one now can get access to and get a sense of what this might be like. And it sort of linked to this first aspect is a second aspect, what I call a collage aesthetic, which I see that really brings all these previously mentioned elements together to emphasize how by having all these elements at the same place, it produced a very particular kind of visual scene and experience. And that's what really you would want to experience when you come to these places. And as a base or basis of this collage aesthetic is a characterization of the selective, preserved industrial or historical features and traces in the built environment, which characterize them as having a particular kind of beauty and almost a poetic quality. And the media narrative really plays a very important role here to create this image, to create this characterization. So for example, this quote about 7 and 8, emphasizing all these different elements about the factory floor, the bricks and the Cultural Revolution slogans, and ended with standing here, letting the time go by, you seem to be able to hear revolutionary sounds coming through the windows, which gives you a very strong sort of a poetic characterization of what these places may offer one if you come to visit. But some of the artists also they themselves trying to reinforce this idea as well. So here again is a media coverage about 7 and 8 in the early days, where they interviewed this photographer Xu Yong, who had a space in 7 and 8. And in that, he talked about how they did all this selective preservation of the past in factory buildings and some of the deliberate efforts in, for example, making the slogans left from the Cultural Revolution era more beautiful. The photo here is exactly that same space where Xu used to have a art space in 7 and 8, and those slogans on the ceiling are the ones that he talked about, that they brushed dirt off and to make it more beautiful. I find it's a bit ironic to think about how a slogan associated with Cultural Revolution now being talked about by some artists as being beautiful and being a desirable decoration of an art space. But so once we've seen this sort of construction about how particular traces left from the industrial use or from the historical era now being constructed as beauty, as there is a poetic quality of it, then we move on to see how this collage being constructed through looking into how this juxtaposition or integration of all these different elements, the industrial, the historical, but also the artistic and the fashionable uses of them, to make, it really seems like this is a very special kind of place. So here, for example, this code emphasizing how these different elements are sort of having a dynamic, having a conversation that goes beyond temporal spatial limitations. Is a very sort of vivid example of how this collage is constructed through media narratives. But it's also about the sort of the general built environment that's being talked about in these arts districts, which portrays these places as having all these strange and clashing elements together, but also create a particular kind of harmonious and charming experience. So for example, in this coverage about Huang Jueping, it highlights or emphasizes where standing here, you see the tall chimneys of the power plant in the back, and you see the arts districts at the front. All these elements together constitute a distinct charm of this place. And similarly, in some early coverage of 7 and 8, this particular kind of clashing but yet charming description is really being highlighted in a lot of these narratives. So one example here are these reporters, they saw a fashion show happening in 7 and 8 while they were there. And then, so they were sort of emphasizing this, how with a fashion crowd in the front, but you have the huge chimney and boilers in the background. What a strange scene, so clashing, but also so harmonious. But in addition to the built environment, the mix of people is also part of this collage aesthetic or image that's being constructed about arts districts. So here, artists, workers, and local residents are depicted as living and working side by side naturally and normally. And again, this quote from the same reporters who talked about the fashion show in 7 and 8 arts district, where they then say, we saw among the fashionable dressed audience, there was a worker in his muddy factory uniform, and then talk about how no one was really paying attention to him, and he seems to be among this fashion crowd, nothing really strange about it. Everyone seemed to think that it was very natural and very normal. And same kind of thing happens in the coverage about Huang Jueping as well, where it's very much emphasized on how everyone are like peers in these arts districts, that you got professors, students, freelance artists, they can debate in the local tea houses like peers. And if you go on the campus, even porters might encounter famous artists like Luo Zhongli and Ye Yongqing. So Luo and Ye are two of the most famous artists coming out of this Fine Art Institute and coming from the IJURR. So they're constantly being brought up in these sort of narratives about just anyone on the street, you might run into a famous artist, and all these are things to be really natural and normal. So with all these sort of collage that's being constructed about arts districts, and through this narrative, it presents that the industrial past, the historical traces, art, artists, factory workers, and local residents, they all become interesting elements that make arts districts as places that can offer distinct and novel experiences. So here one could experience very unusual encounters of these drastically different spheres, but also only here when this sort of otherwise clashing or unusual combination of elements could be combined and integrated into each other in a very smoothly and natural way. So this code that I put here sort of really highlights this aspect where this person talked about how this combination of factory environment and spectacular arts really create a surreal experience. And it's really rare to see how these different spheres could live so peacefully with each other and could even supplement and benefit each other. So together, the sort of the mystery aesthetic and the collage aesthetic together constitutes a particular aesthetic of arts districts, which characterize these places as where one can experience a mix of something novel, something nostalgic, and something beautiful. So, for example, this code saying this is where you get an air of novelty, nostalgia, and avant-garde blown onto your face. And it is this particular aesthetic that makes arts districts attractive or interesting to a visitor or tourist who may not necessarily be interested in going to see an art exhibition in the first place. So just to end my part, having looked into what goes into constructing or making an aesthetic of arts districts, I want to briefly touch upon what I see as the implications of this production and consumption of arts districts or the aesthetic of arts districts. So in the construction of the aesthetic of arts districts, the elements associated with these places are all reduced into components that make these places novel, interesting, and distinct. And the aestheticization of these elements leads to depoliticization of them. So in the past, whether it is the Cultural Revolution, the socialist central planning, or the sort of the economic restructuring that made the nowadays chic industrial rundown look, in the first place, they all sort of being talked in a very political way in these narratives about arts districts, and they're all romanticized and sanitized to a large extent. So what is foregrounded here is the special kind of beauty of these historical traces that's still left in the built environment. And there's nothing really being talked about what actually these past entails what they represent. And very similarly, the post-industrial environment and the presence of workers and local residents in these spaces are talked about in terms of their beauty and charm. There's not really any questions about or any discussions about people's livelihoods in these narratives about arts districts. For example, in the case of Huang in Chongqing, the fact that it is arts districts is because it's a working class and relatively low income neighborhood, which makes it affordable to artists who relies on relatively unstable income sources. And most of the residents living in the neighborhood, they were workers or they were laid off or retired from warehouses or the railway or the dock, the power plant in the neighborhood. And many of these employers were getting shut down or already shut down. So there's very much a question about poor living condition and poverty and livelihoods in relation to these neighborhoods. But these aspects are not what attract attention to the neighborhood. And local residents and only sort of being talked about only when these narratives about arts district came, and they only were depicted as components that make this particular arts district and neighborhood interesting and authentic. So overall, there is a sort of an aestheticization of poverty going on in these narratives, especially about this particular neighborhood, which sort of helps even displace these questions about livelihood and poor living condition further. And in addition to all this, that art is also sort of has been turned into a decorative feature of these places and not really assumes or no longer assumes a sort of a function of social critique. And even some artists themselves have actively participated in producing, promoting, and consuming the aesthetic of arts districts. So I'm going to end my part, and to end, I just want to say that there are continuity between some of the components, elements, and effects that I identify here in relation to the consumption of arts districts and this emerging phenomenon of internet celebrity urbanism or internet celebrity cities. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Asa and Colin to talk more about what we see are related to that particular phenomenon. Thank you. I can't stop sharing.
Okay. Right, I have, thank you, Amy. I have 3 slides to share, which will just take us through my very brief discussion. So I'm going to talk more about the city of Chongqing and kind of picking up on some of the elements which Amy covered so comprehensively, thinking about what it is about Chongqing that has led it to become a particular site of internet celebrity imaging, a particularly popular destination for influencers, wanghong, short videos shot in China. So there was a white paper published by ByteDance and Tsinghua University in 2018, which stated that Chongqing was the capital wanghong chengshi capital internet celebrity city in China at the time, with over 11 billion videos, short videos like TikTok videos, shot there in the preceding year. And this has played into a kind of broader, imaging of Chongqing and a particular aesthetics of how Chongqing is imagined both within and without the city, which I think is really interesting, partly because the particular sites which are imaged as sites of internet celebrity, as sites of viral culture in Chongqing, pick up on precisely those aesthetics which Amy touched on, the idea of the sites which are both clashing and harmonious, which combine novelty with nostalgia and are beautiful in some sense. And yeah, we see this really nicely in some of these images of the typical wanghong chengshi sites in Chongqing. The Hongyedong, which is a kind of site of traditional architecture which has been built in a superlatively large scale, very modern mall essentially built as traditional architecture. The imagery of Chongqing as a cyberpunk, Chongqing is a cyberpunk city in some sense. And this growing notion of it as a 5D magical city, 5D obviously superlatively because it's more than just 3-dimensional, more than 4-dimensional, it's 5-dimensional. And I want to focus in on one particular site which has become a kind of symbol of Chongqing's internet celebrity status, the site of the 𝗲𝗲𝗻𝗲𝗿 subway station or light rail station, which was built in 2004, planned in the late 1990s, and which has become a site which people visit during tourist trips to Chongqing because it is a light rail station which is situated between the 6th and 8th floors of a residential block of flats. So what we are looking at here is a residential block of flats with some shops on the ground floor, but with a light rail station where the train passes in this side and leaves the other side. And when I was doing my fieldwork in Chongqing from 2015 to 2017, I started to notice a growing trend of people taking videos of this, either riding the train itself or standing on the street outside, videoing the train passing into the building. And since 2017, we've seen a real kind of emergence of the popularity of this site on social media platforms, on Douyin in particular. And this is fascinating because it shows that these sites of internet celebrity are not just sites which are kind of deliberately constructed to convey a sense of internet celebrity or to be a site of spectacle, but they can be accidental spectacles. Indeed, infrastructure itself can be a form of spectacle which can attract internet celebrity status. And this brings some really interesting questions as to the kind of urban politics of these spaces. Infrastructure, the wanghong status of Chongqing and other cities in Western China itself is imagined as a form of infrastructure to enable further development. This is a cartoon from Xinhua in 2019, where they posit that the idea of the internet celebrity urbanism is helping to increase the attractive power of these cities to help them grow a new economy by attracting young, talented graduates to come and live there. And then we also see that feeding back onto the urban space itself. What we're looking at on the right of this slide here is a plan that was published in last year to redevelop the site of the 𝗲𝗲𝗻𝗲𝗿 subway station, to reclad it in bright colors outside, to add some vertical greening effects, to construct an extra large viewing platform on the street below, and a giant LED screen on the side of the building, which the car itself would plunge through as it arrived at this station. And this met with a lot of criticism online from local residents who said it was destroying this unique part of the city and turning it into a gaudy tourist attraction, much like any other. So I think the questions which are raised here are what does it mean when these aesthetics of kind of the clashing and the harmonious, the novel and the nostalgic are applied to infrastructure itself, applied to bits of the city which it's not simple to just kind of reconstruct, move, reposition, but which are come into contradictions with the actual day-to-day running of the city. And as Amy said, how does this then impact on local residents themselves? And I'll pass over to Carwyn very quickly.
Cheers, Asa. So I'm just going to be doing the last sort of few minutes of this, where so I'm going to start. Is that coming through clearly for everybody? I know you can see my tabs at the top, but hey, cool. So I'm going to start my portion just by thinking about the digital geography of internet celebrity urbanism. As you can see, the wanghong the sort of tech company that makes these things, they have a very specific geography. They're centered in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, a lot of them in Beijing. So these tech companies that produce the wanghong, that enable the wanghong chengshi to emerge, are tier 1 cities. But as we see, so here we have a little map. The red dots are where some of these cities are. So there are 2 smaller, of the top 10 video streaming companies, there are 2 smaller ones in Changsha and Wuhan, but the vast majority of them are centered around Beijing, Shanghai, and different parts of Guangdong. So the lighter shaded bit is basically where all of the so-called wanghong chengshi exist. And this is about these, who knows what it's about, but the effect is tier 1 coastal cities with large internet companies where tech-oriented people go to live, turn the tier 2, the periphery, from their core to the periphery. They turn them into sites where profit is generated. All of the profit from the 10, 12 billion videos of Chongqing, how this data is used, how the profit is generated, the advertising revenue, most of that goes towards these core cities in the tier 1. So the production of the Wanghong city aids the continued resource extraction and profit in these cities. And it is profiting off the aesthetics, the accidental infrastructural Wanghongness of Chongqing or the art district of other sites. And that might not necessarily be beneficial towards these other cities, as I think Asa was suggesting. In our conversation, Asa spoke previous to this, he's talked about how he's spoken to people who sell or buy things at these, who sell goods at these sites of tourist spectacle in Chongqing. And many of them complain about the fact that nobody actually buys their thing. People are going there, they are consuming these sites of spectacle through their phone. They're consuming it for an audience back home. They are generating profit for the internet company, but they're not necessarily generating any profit for the people who are using these sites in Chongqing, or who are setting up stalls in Chengdu or somewhere like this. So what this turns to, if we look at Chengdu, is people checking in. What is daka, like check in, is what people talk about. People, when you just check in, it doesn't talk about your engagement with a space. It doesn't talk about you using or creating solidarity or supporting that place. It's about you showing that you've been somewhere and showing that off to other people. And as you see here, people from around tier 1 cities in China go to places like Chengdu, sites of internet celebrity urbanism, to check in. And it's sort of a way for the tier 1 people working a dogged life to relax in other ways. But we don't quite know how it helps people in Chengdu or Changsha or Xi'an or Kunming. So I'm using a lot of stuff here from some consultancy reports about how to become a wanghong chengshi and the dynamics of the wanghong chengshi. But here at the bottom of this, it says, on Douyin, Chengdu is already a wanghong. But how did Chengdu become a wanghong? Here, it's not the city, it's not a wanghong chengshi. Chengdu itself is the influencer. So how does Chengdu become an influencer? What is the effect of Chengdu being an influencer within this? And as you can see, this is consumed a lot through the screen. Digital images are produced in Chengdu, but they are sent elsewhere. And when this is turned into data and analyzed, companies like this suggest certain forms of consumption and certain forms of action that should be promoted within the cities. This can, yeah, we know in the tourist literature that this can have an effect on how cities are made, but here we have something else because of the Dakar, the check-in culture. But it does reorient how the urban experience of Chengdu is for the people who check in there, but that also influences how Chengdu is experienced for the people who live there as well. So finally, I'll just leave you with 𝗬𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗲𝗿 that was from Changsha, but it's more recently moved to Guangzhou, and 3 weeks ago it moved to Shenzhen. And if you want to go into 𝗬𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗲𝗿, you need to take part in a lottery system. I was speaking to one of my friends in Shenzhen the other day. She tried 8 times to get into 𝗬𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗲𝗿 in the 2 weeks that it's been open, and she has failed every single time. But she has taken a lot of photos and sent them to me. She has checked in to 𝗬𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗲𝗿. But here Amy talked about the sanitization. 𝗬𝗲𝗿𝗁𝗲𝗿 is the reproduction of an old alleyway, an old dirty alleyway, but it is completely sanitized. It has a 5-star food rating and is extremely expensive to buy anything from there. In this way, Changsha, Shenzhen, the history of Changsha is being exploited for current profit. But we also want to think about what is being consumed here. It costs a lot of money to make one of these wanghong. This is not accidental wanghong urbanism. This is purposeful wanghong urbanism. It costs a lot of money to make a wanghong urban spectacle. Once again, we see that a few people are generating a lot of profit from wanghong urbanism. It is the person who can afford to reproduce an entire city alleyway in the center of Changsha who profits off of this. It is bike dance or kuaishou who are profiting off of this. We're not sure if it is a local person who is profiting off of this. For us, this internet celebrity urbanism is very much a research agenda. It's something that we want to look at, to further think through, to explore. And we'd be interested to know the audience's opinions on this. Who do you think is profiting off of this? Do you feel you have profited off of any of the wanghong chengshi or the wanghong sites that you've been to? And finally, I guess my question is, that consultancy company was saying, how did Chengdu become a wanghong? In this wanghong chengshi, in this internet celebrity urbanism, a question is, who is the internet celebrity and what are the effects of being internet celebrity? Is the city the internet celebrity? Is the wanghong gongsi the real? Is the tech company the real internet celebrity here? Or is the person who's streaming a video to their WeChat group of 500 people the wanghong, a very mini wanghong? So a question that I have to everybody is, who is the wanghong and what is the wanghong in wanghong chengshi or internet celebrity urbanism? Thank you very much. And I guess we'd be happy to have any Q&A things that we have there.